Audrey Meadows stood by Jackie Gleason on one of television's most iconic stages, The Honeymooners. But for everything the world saw on screen, there was something no one ever noticed. For decades, she kept quiet, never challenged the spotlight, never corrected the applause. But what Audrey finally revealed about what Jackie took from her left even the most loyal fans shaken. And the truth, it wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was quiet, and it stayed with her until the end. Long before the silence, before the private regret, before the weight she carried quietly for years, Audrey Meadows was simply Alice, America's sweetheart, the sharp-tongued, warm-hearted wife who knew how to keep Ralph Kramden in line with just a glance. To millions of viewers, she was the woman who made the Honeymooners feel real, grounded, familiar. But for Audrey, stepping into that role wasn't just a job. It was an invitation into something far bigger than anyone could have imagined. She didn't look like a television wife in the beginning. In fact, when she first auditioned for the role of Alice Kramden, she was told she was too pretty, too glamorous. Jackie Gleason had a very specific vision. He wanted someone who felt like the kind of woman his audience lived with. Someone real, strong, no nonsense. The kind of woman who wouldn't back down from a man like Ralph. So Audrey went home, scrubbed off the makeup, put on a plain dress, tied back her hair, and posed for a new photo. When Gleason saw it, he didn't even recognize her. That was the Alice he had imagined. And just like that, she won the part. Not because she was flashy or famous, but because she understood what it meant to be underestimated. What followed was lightning in a bottle. The Honeymooners exploded into one of the most beloved sitcoms in television history. Jackie Gleason's comedic genius as Ralph Kramden was undeniable, but even the critics, especially the ones who truly paid attention, noticed something deeper. Audrey wasn't just playing the straight woman. She was grounding the chaos. While Ralph shouted, Audrey's quiet strength carried the scene. Her timing was sharp, her wit disarming, and her expressions could level a man twice her size without a single word. Behind the scenes, though, things weren't as perfectly balanced. Jackie Gleason was the star, the great one. His name was on the marquee, his face in the spotlight, and his creative control was absolute. Everyone else, no matter how vital to the show's success, orbited around his gravitational pull. And Audrey? She didn't push back. Not publicly, not in interviews, not when the credit passed her by again and again. But that didn't mean she didn't notice. Those who knew her off camera describe her as gracious, professional, and deeply intuitive. She understood that to survive in the television world of the 1950s, especially as a woman, you had to pick your battles. You had to smile through it. And Audrey smiled. Beautifully, consistently, and with just enough steel behind it to hold the entire show together. Even Jackie knew it in his own way. Though he rarely gave praise, when asked why the Honeymooners worked, he admitted once that the chemistry between Ralph and Alice was lightning. What he didn't say, but what many now believe, is that Audrey was the one holding the lightning rod. Fans adored her. Women saw themselves in her. Men respected her. But the industry, the headlines, the legacy, it mostly belonged to Jackie. And as the years passed, so did the credit. So did the recognition. And Audrey, ever composed, never demanded it back. But later in life, she finally said what the Honeymooners had cost her, and what Jackie Gleason, without ever realizing it, had taken. To the outside world, Jackie Gleason was the Honeymooners. His voice, his charisma, his wild outbursts of bang, zoom, and to the moon, Alice, were what viewers remembered most. He was the hurricane at the center of the show. And Audrey Meadows? She was the calm. But here's what most people never understood. The storm doesn't work without the anchor. Audrey was never loud, never demanding, and never outshined Jackie. But her presence, firm, centered, emotionally steady, was what allowed Jackie's chaos to shine without becoming unbearable. She was, in many ways, the balance. But that balance came at a cost. Jackie Gleason had near-total creative control over the show. He hired the writers, shaped the scenes, and directed the emotional tone. That meant everyone else, Audrey included, was expected to follow. She could deliver lines with grace and bite. She could hold her own in every scene. But she couldn't question Jackie. Not in public. Not in rehearsal. And certainly not when it came to credit. What Jackie took from Audrey wasn't a role or a paycheck or a spotlight in the literal sense. What he took was the space to be recognized. The room to be seen not just as the wife in a comedy sketch, but as the artist who held the performance together. In her later years, Audrey finally admitted, quietly without bitterness, that there were moments she wished she'd spoken up. Moments when Jackie was celebrated alone, while the world forgot what it meant to share a stage with him. She had to give up the spotlight time and again so the show could function around his energy. It's not that Jackie was cruel. In fact, by all accounts, their working relationship was respectful and largely professional. But that was the problem. Audrey gave so much to the role and to the man leading the show, and never expected anything back. And Jackie, focused entirely on building his own legend, never paused to thank the woman who made his legacy possible. Audrey carried that, not with resentment, but with quiet ache. The kind of ache that comes from knowing you mattered but watching history forget. Even more painful, the fact that the Honeymooners became eternal. Reruns played for decades. The characters became household names. Ralph Cramden was immortalized in pop culture. Jackie Gleason's name was etched into television history. And Audrey? She was remembered, yes, but more as a sidekick than a cornerstone. She once joked that she got more mail as Alice than she ever did as herself. But there was a flicker of something under that smile. Because Alice was loved. But Audrey, the woman who gave Alice life, was barely acknowledged. And Jackie never saw it. He never realized that the foundation of his greatness rested on someone else's quiet strength. What he took wasn't malicious, but it mattered. And Audrey, for years, said nothing, smiled through it, let the applause fall on the man beside her while she stood just out of frame. It wasn't until much later, when the lights dimmed, the shows ended, and her name was barely mentioned in retrospectives, that she finally said it out loud, that Jackie Gleason had taken something from her that couldn't be returned. Not because he meant to, but because no one ever thought to ask what she had given up. When The Honeymooners ended its original run in 1956, Jackie Gleason moved on to more specials, more productions, more headlines. His career surged and retreated in waves, but the legend of the Great One remained untouched. Audrey Meadows, on the other hand, stepped into something far more quiet and far less forgiving. She continued acting, appearing in a few shows, some films, and even commercials. But nothing ever matched the scale or legacy of the Honeymooners. And perhaps that's because, whether she admitted it or not, nothing ever could. The show had been lightning in a bottle, but that lightning, for Audrey, came with a shadow. And once the curtain fell, she was left not just with memories of the show, but with the lingering ache of what it took to survive it. She had played a woman who was often overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. And in doing so, she became exactly that in real life. There were no retrospectives where she sat center stage. No grand tribute specials highlighting her contribution. When people spoke about the Honeymooners, they talked about Gleason's brilliance, his improvisational genius, his towering presence. Audrey? She was remembered fondly, but more as an accessory to his fire than a flame of her own. And yet, her presence never faded completely. For those who really watched the show, she wasn't just the wife. She was the soul. The one who made Ralph Cramden's rage forgivable. The one who gave the show emotional depth. The one who represented real women across the country who knew exactly what it meant to hold a family and a man together without falling apart themselves. But the recognition she deserved never came. In interviews years later, Audrey began to speak more openly but carefully. She never insulted Jackie, never accused. That wasn't her style. But you could hear it in her words, the weight of it, the truth beneath her measured tone. She spoke once about how hard it had been to watch the show back. Not because of the content, she was proud of the work, but because of what it brought up in her. Watching The Honeymooners wasn't just seeing a performance. It was reliving a time in her life when she gave everything to something that would never give it back. That's what Jackie had taken, without malice, without intention, but completely. He took her emotional space, the years, the silence, the credit, and worst of all, the comfort of looking back without pain. After the curtain fell, Audrey didn't chase the spotlight. She married Robert Six, the CEO of Continental Airlines. She became one of the first women to sit on the board of a major bank. She wrote a memoir. She lived with grace and strength, just as she had portrayed on screen. But inside, there was a part of her that never quite put the story to rest, because history had already written its version. Jackie was the star, and Audrey, she was just the wife. That injustice never made her bitter, but it did make her quiet. She knew that if she said it too early, it would sound like jealousy. If she said it too late, no one would listen. So she waited. Decades passed. Tributes were written. Awards were handed out. And only when the world had softened, only when her voice could be heard with compassion, did she finally speak. Not to accuse, not to reclaim glory, but to let the truth breathe, even if it came too late for Jackie to ever hear it. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a dramatic confession in front of cameras or a tell-all betrayal in the pages of a tabloid. That wouldn't have been Audrey. Her truth came the way she lived, quietly, thoughtfully, and years after anyone expected her to say a word. She had been reflecting on her life when she finally opened up. In interviews, in her writing, and in the stories she began to share near the end, Audrey Meadows started letting the real story of the Honeymooners take shape. Not the one printed in TV Guide, but the one etched in memory. What she shared wasn't about Jackie Gleason, the celebrity. It was about Jackie, the presence, the force, the man whose gravity pulled every actor, every scene, every moment into his orbit. And how, for a long time, Audrey stood in that orbit, holding her balance, quietly absorbing what it meant to work with a legend who never once stopped to say, "Thank you." That was the truth. Not that he mistreated her. Not that he stole anything physical. But that he took something far more personal, the space for recognition. The dignity of being seen as an equal. Not just in talent, but in value, in contribution, in legacy. Audrey revealed that playing Alice Cramden took more from her than most people realized. She had to live inside the skin of a woman who was endlessly patient, eternally forgiving, and often unheard. And that character, over time, became a mirror of Audrey herself. She said she had learned how to hold back during the Honeymooners, how to bite her tongue when a scene changed at the last second, how to swallow her pride when Jackie received standing ovations while she walked off stage in his shadow. She called it being a team player. But even she admitted years later that being a team player came at a cost. And that cost was her voice, her visibility, her credit. She revealed that the hardest part wasn't the work. It was realizing, long after the applause faded, that she had helped build something unforgettable and never got to claim her share of it. But Audrey didn't share this truth with anger. That's what makes it so haunting. She shared it with a kind of gentle mourning, as if she had carried this weight for so long that it no longer hurt in sharp ways, just in quiet ones. She said she didn't blame Jackie. That was the world we worked in, she wrote, and maybe that's true. But her words landed differently. They revealed a woman who knew exactly what she gave, and exactly how little the world gave back. She had carried Jackie Gleason's greatness, supported it, balanced it, made it work. And yet, when people remembered the Honeymooners, it was Jackie they saw in their minds. Jackie who got the laughs. Jackie who got the legacy. Audrey's truth wasn't designed to rewrite history, but it did add a missing chapter. One where the woman who made Ralph Cramden's fire forgivable finally stood up and said, "I was there, I mattered, and I remember everything." It wasn't bitterness. It was clarity, a quiet truth finally spoken. And for those who had always sensed it, who watched the show and saw the emotional work she did without ever asking for praise, it felt like validation. She didn't want the spotlight. She just wanted to be heard. And for the first time in decades, she was. There's something quietly tragic about being essential and yet invisible. Audrey Meadows was essential, not just to the Honeymooners, but to the shape of television itself. She helped define what a sitcom wife could be: sharp, loving, grounded, and unshakably human. Without her, Ralph Kramden wasn't a character, he was just noise. She gave his chaos context, his bluster weight, his failure warmth. But ask most people who made the Honeymooners great, and the answer still circles back to Jackie Gleason. That's the legacy Audrey never claimed. Not because it wasn't hers, but because she was taught by the era, by the industry, by the silence expected of women in the 1950s that good work should be enough. That being part of something big was its own reward. That supporting someone else's genius was noble. And maybe it was. But it was also erasing. Long after the Honeymooners ended, Audrey continued living with grace. She became a trailblazer outside of Hollywood, serving as the first woman on the board of a major bank. She joined Continental Airlines as a corporate director. She navigated boardrooms with the same poise and presence she once brought to the screen. She was respected, admired, but in the public eye, she remained mostly Alice. She was proud of that, but she was also aware of its limitations. In her memoir, she acknowledged the contradiction, that the role which defined her also confined her. She didn't get offered roles of equal strength after the Honeymooners because Hollywood couldn't see past Alice Kramden. She became a household name, but in service of someone else's narrative. Gleason's legacy soared. Audrey's, in contrast, quietly folded into the backdrop of his. And she never demanded more. That's what makes her story resonate so deeply now. Because Audrey Meadows represents a kind of quiet, generational sacrifice, one so many women recognize. The kind where your brilliance isn't denied, just politely ignored. The kind where your value is felt but never named. The kind where you become part of history, but never the headline. Even as tributes to the Honeymooners continued to roll out in the decades after its run, Audrey's name often appeared second, or not at all. The Emmy she won for the role? A footnote. The residuals she received, thanks to a smart clause in her contract negotiated by her brother, were one of the only tangible acknowledgments that her work mattered. But Audrey never led with that. She didn't tell people how she held the show together. She didn't correct the record. She didn't seek out accolades. She simply waited. And eventually, when the time was right, she shared the truth. And here's the thing about truths like Audrey's. They don't scream. They don't demand. They whisper. And once you hear them, you can't unhear them. Fans who grew up watching the Honeymooners began to reevaluate everything. Suddenly, they weren't just laughing at Ralph. They were watching Alice. Watching her eyes. Her stillness. Her strength. Seeing, maybe for the first time, how much she gave. Because Audrey Meadows didn't just act in those scenes. She anchored them. And though she never claimed the legacy she earned, the people who truly understood began to see her differently. They saw not the sitcom wife, but the woman behind her. The one who carried the show. The one who gave more than she got. The one who stayed silent until the world was finally ready to listen. And now, all these years later, it's clear. Audrey Meadows was never just part of Jackie Gleason's story. He was part of hers. Audrey Meadows never raised her voice. She didn't fight for the spotlight or chase recognition. She let her work speak, until the world was finally quiet enough to hear what it had been saying all along. She stood beside one of television's most powerful figures, matched him, balanced him, and for years no one said it out loud, not even her. But in the end, she did say it. Softly, clearly. She told the world what Jackie Gleason took from her. Not with bitterness, but with the kind of grace that makes the truth even harder to forget. It wasn't about blame. It wasn't about revenge. It was about finally letting herself be seen, not as Alice, not as a supporting act, but as the woman who gave the Honeymooners its soul. And maybe now that's the legacy she leaves behind. Not just the jokes, not just the reruns, but the quiet reminder that some of the most powerful performances are the ones that never ask for applause. For more emotional stories, check out this video.